Hi, everyone. You are listening to For Those We Lost. I'm your host, Jennifer Sullivan. Thank you for being here. If you've lost a loved one to COVID and would like to share your story on the show, please send me an email. My email address is forthosewelostpodcast@gmail.com. Or you can go to the website, forthosewelostpodcast.com, and click on the contact button and reach me that way as well. This show won't ever have a members area or episodes that you have to pay to listen to, but there are expenses to hosting a podcast. And if you'd like to help, you can support this show at buymeacoffee.com/forthosewelost. In this show, people share their stories of losing a loved one to COVID. As the pandemic continues, many of us feel the weight of the world wanting to move on and the pain of our loss that holds us tight. For us, there is no avoiding the ever-present reminder that we lost a loved one to COVID. It is with us every day, everywhere. What you hear in each story is grief, sadness, and love. We will more than likely talk about the vaccine and maybe a little bit about politics, and you may not agree. But I hope you'll keep listening. I hope you'll stay to the end of each episode and realize that each person who openly shares here has experienced deep grief over the loss of a loved one. And that's something we will all experience. We all love someone, we will all lose someone we love, and we will all grieve. These are the stories of those we lost to COVID. Thanks for being here with me. I've got a really wonderful show coming up for you. Today, I'll be talking to Debra in Florida. Debra lost her brother, Bobby, to COVID on April 29th, 2020. Bobby was born intellectually disabled, and so even though he was 55 when he passed, as Debra says, he was very much a big kid. He had a caring nature and lived in the moment. Debra misses him so deeply, and you can feel her love for her brother as she talks about him. For context, we recorded this episode on March 15th, 2022. Debra's grief over losing Bobby is profound, and after some dark months, she found a COVID support group, and that led her to the Yellow Heart Memorial. Debra heads up the Florida chapter of the Yellow Heart Memorial, and they have a physical location at the Crystal River Mall. She talks about her charity, Bobby's Bikes, and her friend's charity, Savannah Smiles. So I've included a lot of links in the show notes, and also the form you can use to submit your loved one's name to the Florida Yellow Heart Memorial. And with that, I'd like to welcome Debra to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you reached out and sent me an email. I want to start where I usually start, with how things were for you in March of 2020 and when you first heard about COVID and what your family did. Let me just roll back a little bit. You're in Florida.
Yes.
And where at in Florida?
Citrus Springs.
Okay. And your brother, who you're talking about today, Bobby, he was in Indiana.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So just start at March of 2020 and how you first heard about COVID and what your family did.
Okay. So I first heard about COVID a couple of months before that because my husband drinks Corona and he heard coronavirus on the news. So he was in tune to that. And, just checking the news every so often to see what was going on. So I knew about it, but like it was just something on the news, at that point. Well, around March, I was starting to get a little worried. I had just come from Atlanta. I went there to watch um, the Olympics marathon like trials. So I was around a lot of people. In hindsight, I wish I had not gone. Although I was fine. I didn't get sick, but I did at least think I should probably bring some disinfectant for the hotel. So the idea of this could get bad was already starting to develop in my head. So I got back, and at that time we were living in South Carolina. So early March, I'm in South Carolina. And I went to the store one day and I thought, maybe I should buy some masks. Well, I feel silly buying a mask. Do I really need a mask? Like, because we weren't told to wear a mask yet, but it was just this idea. And I thought, I'll just get one box. So I get one box, and I couldn't find hand sanitizer that day. And I was like, ooh, that's odd. So I spent the next several weeks in South Carolina, and my brother was taking over the house that we were living in. So it was my brother, my niece, my nephew, myself, and my husband. And I was really worried because the kids were teenagers, and I thought, my husband has a compromised immune system, and I don't want them to get him sick. And they were going to school and just doing, the regular activities. And I was just in panic mode already, thinking, oh my God, what if they bring it home? What if Steve gets sick? Like, I can't handle that. So we closed on our house. We moved to Florida about April 1st. So I had a little bit of relief, like, okay, it's just us. I don't have to worry about someone else bringing the virus to us. So we'll just start being a little careful, but still, I was not in full panic mode yet. Full panic mode came April 8th when I received a call that Bobby had the virus. And I had been watching the news already, so I knew that people were getting it. I knew people were dying. And as soon as I heard that he had the virus, I dropped to my knees. And my husband said, well, just because he has it, that doesn't mean something bad's going to happen. But I had this sick feeling in my stomach immediately.
Yeah. And tell me about your brother. You told me so much about him when we talked on the phone, and it's all just wonderful stuff. Just tell me about your brother.
Oh, Bobby was wonderful. So my mom had 6 children, and Bobby was the third born. And he was born with brain damage that caused him to have an intellectual disability. So though he was 55, he was really more like a big kid, maybe a 10, 12-year-old kid. He loved to have fun. He loved to live in the moment. If you said, hey, Bobby, do you want to go to bingo? He'd jump in the car. He's like ready to go. And he never held a grudge. You almost never saw him upset. He just really enjoyed living life, and he was just good in that way. I never saw him be racist or ugly, none of those things. He was just, I mean, he wasn't perfect, but he was a good example of what pure love looked like.
Yeah.
And he was such a giver. And he had very little means because of his disability. He lived on a disability check. That was his income, which is not a lot of money. And if he heard or saw that someone was in need, he would fix it. He would make sure that that person had whatever it was they needed. And I have so many examples, but um, my brother was on the beach with him, another brother, my brother Tim, and Bobby asked him for some money to buy some donuts. And Tim's like, what? Why do you need donuts? And he said, well, there's these people over there. They're homeless. They need some food. And so
Oh.
I gave him some money so Bobby could get them some food. And another time, a friend of Tim's showed up at my mom's house at Christmas. Bobby loved Christmas more than anyone. So this guy shows up, and of course, there wasn't any gifts because he just came out of nowhere. Bobby left the room, and a little while later came back with a wrapped gift and handed it to him. And it was a purple sweatshirt, and the guy loved it. But it was just so sweet that Bobby couldn't stand this guy didn't have a gift. So he had to get him a gift. And he always remembered my birthdays. Um, Even if like he would sometimes he would like buy a gift and make sure I got it, but get to the post office and all of that was kind of a thing. But he always at least made sure he called. So like he was just so thoughtful.
Yeah. And where was he living when COVID first started in March of 2020?
He was living at a nursing home in Clarksville, Indiana, and he was there as a pit stop. This was not where he was going to live for the rest of his life. He was supposed to be going to assisted living, and someone dropped the ball,
Mm.
and he was at the nursing home longer than he was supposed to be. And while he was sick, I talked to the social worker who said she would make it a priority that he got into assisted living once he got better. But at the time, no one was accepting anybody with COVID, or I think maybe not even new people. But that's where he was supposed to go so he could still have some independence. Because although he was disabled, he did really well living on his own. He was in the program that Catholic Charities put together when he was about maybe 18, 19 years old, and they taught him how to live on his own. And he was the first graduate of the program,
Mm.
and he had his own apartment, he paid his own bills, he bought his own food, he did everything for himself. So when he needed some care to take his medicines on time and things like that, all he needed was assisted living. He never needed full nursing home care.
Yeah. And so he tested positive on April 8th.
Yes.
And why don't you go ahead and tell me what happened? Tell everyone what happened after that.
So, like I said, I received that call, and oh, I was just like, oh my gosh, I've been seeing this on the news. This isn't good. But every day that he was in the hospital, I called the nurses, and then I would call him. And then later in the evening, I would call the nurses again to get an update. And we had a family text going on. So every day I did this, and every time I got an update, I sent the information to my other brothers. And that was just our routine. And Bobby was so funny because he was always so proud of me. And after I would call the nurses, I would call him, and a nurse would walk in his room, and he's like, "Hey, my sister's on the phone," trying to like hand them the phone to talk to me. And I'm like, Bobby, I already talked to the nurses. I don't need to talk to them again. But it was like he just wanted them to talk to me because I'm his sister. So, so I spent the next several weeks doing that, calling and checking and talking with him. And there was one weekend that things got a little scary, and he was taking a little bit of a turn for the worse. But after the weekend, he was good again.
Mhm.
And I thought, okay, he's going to make it through this. But that weekend, I was extra nervous. And Monday of April, it was an April or a Monday in April. The date's not coming to me, but I talked to him that day, and he sounded really good. And that I had already received a really good report from the nurses that he didn't have a fever and he was doing great. And he sounded normal. And that day he said, "Am I going to die?" And I said, "No, Bobby, you're not going to die." I said, "You're one of the lucky ones. The nurses said you're doing great." And I really believed that when I said it. I believed every word of that when I said it. And now I have a lot of guilt for telling him I lied to him. And I don't feel good about that. But that was Monday. So that following Thursday was the 23rd. That was my birthday. So the first thing I did was
Mhm.
I called and said, "Hey, Bobby, guess what day it is?" He goes, "Your birthday." I said, "Did you get me something?"
Mhm.
And he said, "Well, I tried to." And I said, "Well, Bobby, the world's upside down right now." And, giving him a pass, of course, and just, I was totally teasing from the beginning. But I thought maybe he meant that he was trying to get something from the gift shop sent to me. Well, I didn't find out until later after he passed. The gift that he tried to get to me was a painting that he made. And he walked all around the nursing home asking everybody for a pretty box so he could mail it to his sister.
Oh.
he never got a box, but that's what he was talking about that day. But,
Oh,
I had plans that day with a friend and we were going to go running. And I remember letting him go. And I said, "Well, Bobby, I'm going to go for a run." He said, "Don't get the virus." I said, "Oh, no, Bobby, it's okay. Like, there's nobody outside. The trail's closed. I'm good. I'm safe." And I'll never forget that because while he was laying there sick and now I know dying, he cared more about me. He wanted to make sure I was okay. And to this day, I've never taken a test and I have never had a reason to take a test because I've been extra careful because I can't get the virus now because I told Bobby I wouldn't. And
yeah.
I already lied to him and said that he wasn't going to die. So I can't possibly lie to him a second time by getting the virus. So I've been extra careful. But that was April 23rd. That was a Thursday. And they let him go from the hospital. He was doing great.
Mm,
So we thought this is wonderful. He
mhm.
got sent back over to the nursing home. Oh, let me back up. Later, I found out that two patients were put in his room that were both COVID patients. So
Oh,
one got put in there with him as his roommate. That person got COVID and died. And then they put a second person in there who got COVID and died. So likely one of those two patients are who infected Bobby, or maybe staff brought it in. I know Bobby didn't do it because he didn't leave. My mom had become crippled around November, and the nursing home went on lockdown around February or March. So Bobby didn't go anywhere.
yeah.
He he couldn't have gotten this on his own. So anyway, so he gets sent back to the nursing home after the hospital stay, and I couldn't reach anybody on that Friday. I called the main line and nobody would answer. And I mean, I called a lot and just kept letting the phone ring and ring and ring. Well, finally, I got a hold of somebody Saturday morning and I said, "I want to talk to my brother. I've talked to him every day. I couldn't talk to him yesterday and I want updates. I want to know what's going on with him." So they finally patched me through to his room and we talked, and I knew something was very, very wrong. He wasn't himself anymore. He was absolutely talking like himself on Thursday. By Saturday, he kept saying, "I messed up." I was like, "What are you talking about, Bobby?" He's like, "I messed up. I
Mm,
messed up." And I said, "Bobby, you didn't mess up anything. What are you talking about?" And this went on for a couple hours. He just kept telling me over and over and over again he messed up. And so I have two theories about that. One is maybe he thought he did something wrong to get the virus.
yeah.
And the other theory is he was having diarrhea at the time, that maybe
Oh,
messed his pants. I'll never know. But I knew something was wrong. So a nurse's aide came in and she said, "Get him out of here. Get him back to the hospital because this place is not good for him." So I said, "Well, how do I do that?" And she said, "Well, just call the main number and ask them." I said, "Okay." So I did. I called the first time, talked to someone named Kim, and told her we want him taken back to the hospital. Something's clearly not right. She said, "I'll call the doctor, I'll call an ambulance, and I'll call you back." I said, "Okay." About an hour and a half or so goes by, and I didn't hear from her. So I called again, this time speaking to Heather, who said the same thing. "I'll call the doctor, I'll call an ambulance, and I'll call you back." Well, many hours went by,
oh,
and still no return phone call. My oldest brother conferenced my mom in on a call. So it was mom, Brian, myself, and a nurse at the nursing home. And my mom demanded, she said, "I want Bobby taken back to the hospital. There's something wrong with him." And she was adamant. I mean, she was fighting hard with this guy. And he's like, "Oh, Roberta, you're just being overdramatic. Bobby's fine. He's just going through the throes of the virus. He's going to be okay. Bobby's my buddy." And finally, mom accepted that. And later, when I called again for an update, the same nurse said, that the hospitals were turning people away. And I said, well, what if Bobby needs to go back? Like, can you promise me that you'll make sure he goes back? Because he was convincing, making me think that he really had this under control and Bobby's going to be okay. And it
Mhm.
was just part of the virus. And another regret I have is my son said, we should just call 911. And I was like, Nick, I think that's a little excessive. Like, I don't know. It just seemed
Mhm.
kind of out there to me. I don't know why. And I really wish we would have called 911 that night and got an ambulance ourselves because they wouldn't. So the next few days, my son was able to go by the nursing home. At the hospital, there was no window. There was no way for him to stand outside. But at the nursing home, Nick could go outside the window. So the first day he went over there, he brought a card and a basket full of just fun things to do and snacks. And then Monday, I called the nursing home again because I was having a hard time getting updates and answers to my phone calls. And because I think Sunday was another day I didn't get to talk to anyone. So
Mm.
Monday, I told the lady that I was speaking to that Nick would bring a cell phone over for Bobby so I could just reach him directly. And she said, well, we can't take anything inside the nursing home. You're not going to be able to do that. And I said, well, no, you can because my son was there last night and dropped off a basket with him. And she said, oh, well, okay. Well, yeah, you can do that. And I said, I want updates every day, at least. Like, tell me what's going on. So Nick went back over there a few more times. One day brought Taco Bell that Bobby loved going to Taco Bell. And um, he didn't eat much of it, which was unusual. But Wednesday, I received a text from one of the nurses who I'd been saying, I want more updates. And the text was, the doctor saw him. Bobby's in good spirits. His lungs sounded good. And I'm like, oh, we're on the other side.
Mhm.
And my brothers and I were celebrating in our text, like, yay, he's making it. And he's going to be okay. 4 hours later, I received a call from the same lady. And I said, well, how are you doing? And she said, well, I've had better days. And she said, I'm calling to tell you that I got called to Robert's room for a code. And I said, what are you talking about? I didn't know what code meant.
Mhm.
She said, Robert passed tonight. I was like, what? Like, how is it that he's gone? He was fine 4 hours ago. And he was found on the floor.
Mm.
And my best guess is he was in respiratory trouble and tried to get up and get himself help because he was really good about knowing what to do in emergencies.
Mhm.
And so I think that he collapsed and died there on the floor with nobody around. And at the beginning of the whole thing, I told my husband, if Bobby goes on a vent, I'm going to try to go to the hospital because I don't want him to die alone. And the nurse said that maybe they would let somebody in with him because he was classified as MR and they were making exceptions in the pediatrics.
Mhm.
And my husband said, no, you're not doing that. And I said, okay, we agreed if Bobby goes on a vent, then I would. But he never went on events, so I didn't. But my fear was that he would die alone. I wanted to at least be there with him if this was going to be his fate, and he died alone. I, I, I'll, I, I can never accept that Bobby, being such a good person, died a very cruel and horrific death. Because it wasn't just dying on the floor, it was all the weeks leading up to that, all of the fevers, all of the he was starting to see monsters and things when he was back at the nursing home when he kept saying I messed up and like things were just wrong. But his cough was the most horrific noise I've ever heard in my life. And I could tell how painful it was every time he coughed. And I got the call, and my husband happened to run back to South Carolina to get the rest of our things. And I was like, I still had this lady on the phone. I conferenced my husband in, and I was like, baby, Bobby's gone. He was like, what? And my brother Tim was next to him, and Tim could see in Steve's face something's bad.
Mhm.
And like, I couldn't even hear the lady tell me this without Steve being on the phone. Like, because is this true? You know? And so I just remember I was crying and I was hyperventilating, and my dog kept barking, and I just walked outside and I just kept pacing the yard, and I just started making some phone calls, and I called Nick, and I was like, he died. And I talked to him for a few minutes, and I said, Nick, I gotta call some other people. And he goes, no, Mom. He said, you could just talk to me for a minute. And he was just trying to comfort me.
Mhm.
So then I called George, my other brother, and I said, George, and he said, let me call you back. And I said, no, George, I gotta talk to you right now. And then I had to tell him. And I never believed in my wildest nightmares that Bobby would die of like in a pandemic in a
Mhm.
horrible way.
Yeah, that's how that's how I feel about my mom. I feel like I watched it happen on the news, but it was just never gonna happen to my mom.
Exactly.
And you look at it and you're removed from it, and then all of a sudden it's right there, it slams into you. Yeah. Can I ask some questions? I was wondering if the nursing home ever, if you ever talked to anybody there or asked why they moved people with COVID into your brother's room.
At that point, I already knew this nursing home was not taking care of Bobby as they claimed to be. I'm still waiting for Kim and Heather to call me back, and it's been almost
Mm.
2 years. You know,
Oh,
like,
yeah.
so, and that nurse obviously lied to us when he was trying to be reassuring.
Mhm.
I did file a complaint with the state of Indiana where they did find there was abuse and neglect in the nursing home, and they monitored 3 patient files, and Bobby was included in that. But that's as far as I've gone with it, because when I read the report from the state, it was so horrifying that I couldn't I couldn't go any further. I emotionally was not capable to take another step because a nurse had turned off a patient's oxygen and asked if he was ready to go to heaven. And I thought, as I was reading that, I thought, oh my God, are they talking about Bobby? Because it was patient A, patient B, patient C. And I was like, oh my God. And it wasn't Bobby, but it was still horrifying. So she waited outside of this man's room for 45 minutes for him to die. And she has since been charged, and I don't know the outcome of that, but I would never recommend this nursing home to anyone. I, as a matter of fact, would just tell everyone that their loved one probably won't make it out alive. But my brothers wanted to pursue more, but I think one of them needs to pursue more because I've been diagnosed with PTSD, and I just can't do it.
Yeah.
Just the report alone was way too triggering.
Mhm. Yeah, I complained about my mom's facility too and what happened with her, and I had to make a public records request to get the reports from other people's complaints so that I could have those to add to my complaint about my mom's care, and seeing all And they did. They either redacted or blocked out or something the people's names or any kind of defining information where I would know who they were because it was a small facility, and it was hard to read, very hard to read. And I feel like my mom was in a good memory care, and still, they just I it almost seems like either here's my ideas, they were so overwhelmed by COVID and so confused by the general guidelines of what to do that people just in working there did what they felt they needed or had to do at the time to just get through it. And then the other part of me wonders if they just lost their sense of urgency, you know?
Mhm.
Like, here's this thing, it's happening, but then you can only carry that anxiety for so long and your body can't. And maybe they just, I don't know if this is a good comparison, but and I've never been in war, but when you're in war, you can do it for so long on high anxiety and then your body just crashes. Maybe that's what happened is they kept this high level of alert for so long and then they just couldn't do it anymore.
Mhm.
I don't know.
I do know they were short-staffed because during one of my calls when I complained about not being able to get through, they told me they were short-staffed, and it's like, "Well, wait a minute. How many people are how many people have COVID and how many staff do you have?" And I believe they told me they had 18 patients, which I later learned was untrue. It was more like 50,
Mhm.
and they had 2 people on staff.
Oh my god. Okay. Wow. That that gives me panic right there.
Mhm.
Wow. Mm.
However, I do agree there probably were a lot of people who did, just give it all they could until they couldn't anymore, and I actually know an ICU nurse that's still doing that, and yeah, she's burned out, but she's not gonna let anybody die, so, but it's hard on her. It's taken a toll on this girl.
Yeah, PTSD is definitely, the way to look at it. It's traumatic going through it, and then you and I experienced similar in that we were far removed. Like I could not go in and be with my mom. I made some choices that I look back at now, and I'm like, oh, I wish I hadn't have done that. But you were in another state and communicating with him, your brother, as best you could remotely and experiencing everything from so far away.
It was horrible. While
Hmm.
he was in the hospital, there was a nurse, and my brother Tim said one day, "Well, ask one of the nurses if they'll take a picture of him." I said, "Okay." And this nurse did, and she sent me a picture, and I shared it with our text group. And Bobby looked great. He didn't even look sick. And he was coloring in a coloring book we had sent over to the hospital. He looked perfectly fine. And so that was kind of reassuring.
Yeah.
But the only other time I got a glimpse of him was when Nick was outside the window. Somehow he managed to have Bobby on have FaceTime going. And Bobby wasn't very good with technology, but he was able to see my husband, myself, and our dogs, and he loved our dogs. So I'm sure that cheered him up a little bit. But and Nick took a couple pictures from outside the window, and there was a screen in there, so it's hard to see. But Bobby definitely looked different than he did just maybe a week ago when the nurse at the hospital sent a picture.
Yeah. Were you able to have a funeral or memorial service for him?
In Indiana at the time, the funeral homes were allowing 10 people, a 2-hour viewing, and a 30-minute service. So we did that. And like I said, Bobby lived in the moment.
Yeah.
And if, he would not love going to a sad funeral.
Yeah.
So as soon as the funeral was over, we all changed clothes and we had some t-shirts made. There was a really nice guy in Louisville that just got our shirts finished over the weekend, and with no notice.
Mhm.
So we have these shirts with a smiley face because Bobby loved getting a smiley face balloon anytime he was sick. And he had a speech impediment. So he never said remember. He always said, remember? Do you remember so and so? And I'm like, no, Bobby, my memory is terrible. I don't remember anybody. But always, do you remember this? Do you remember this? So we had shirts that said, remember Bobby with a big smiley face. And we proceeded to my mother's house and waited for the parade to come through that a friend of mine organized. We held bells because Bobby was a Salvation Army bell ringer most of his life, and poster boards that said, Be kind for Bobby. And all of a sudden, we heard a fire truck engine or the fire truck alarms, and we were like, oh, wow, our friend who put this together went big. And like it was like a moment of just getting goosebumps, like, wow. So first the fire truck comes through with their alarms blaring. Then the Salvation Army truck came through. The Special Olympics band came through, followed by tons of friends and family with smiley face balloons attached to the cars. And they went around the block at least 3 times and beeped and made all kinds of noise. And that was fantastic because that's what Bobby would have loved. He would have loved a good time. And so we had this celebration parade for him. And in hindsight, I think I would have just skipped all the funeral stuff
Yeah.
and just went straight to the party.
Yeah. Yeah, he it sounds like he would have liked that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, I know that you're involved in the Yellow Heart Memorial,
Yes.
and please tell us about, what you're doing in Florida and the memorial that you have there.
Okay. So I met Rosie Davis, who founded Yellow Heart Memorial through the COVID Survivors for Change grief groups. So it's nice to see that Rosie has risen from the ashes, literally. We were both in this group and we could just see the darkness in each other's faces. We couldn't talk without crying. It was a really dark time for both of us. But Rosie found a way to memorialize everyone through the Yellow Heart Memorial. So we have a Florida chapter going now. In February, the Crystal River Mall donated space for us, and we gathered names. And if you go to the mall, you'll see over 1,600 names, which is just a drop in the bucket.
Oh, yeah.
We've lost over 65,000 people here in Florida, so
Mm,
but it's a sight to see. But then we included 9 chairs, and they're beautifully decorated, and they have pictures of people from Florida that we've lost, and now we know that we're going to have to add a 10th chair soon,
yes.
and um, and that's hard.
Mhm.
All these people are gone, but in Florida, the virus wasn't taken very seriously by most people, and when we held the memorial, of course we put out press releases and such, and people showed up. They showed up with pictures in hand. They were searching the wall to find their loved one's name. And I was like, wow, I see it in their faces, that desperation for somebody to just acknowledge that their loved one died of COVID.
Yeah.
And it was the same thing that Rosie and I had went through in those early days, but we found each other and we found a group and we found support. But a lady I talked to, she had a very similar story to mine where she lost her brother and nobody understood her until she
Mhm.
showed up at that memorial. And an elderly lady came. She had the virus at the same time as her husband and in the hospital, but they wouldn't let her see him. And he passed. And she had a little newspaper clipping of his picture and was so proud to tell me that the paper had published his picture as one of 12 people at the time that they selected for this article. So These memorials are needed, and
Mhm.
Rosie's doing a fantastic job getting these around the country and now around the world.
Yeah.
We have a Poland chapter now.
Yeah.
So, that's just wonderful.
Yeah. And how long? Is it a permanent memorial there in Crystal River, or is it gonna be is does it have to be taken down?
Ours is temporary.
Okay.
However, the manager of the mall said we can keep it there until the mall sells. And at this time, there's no contract. So we're looking at least a few months, but it could be a few years.
Yeah, let's hope that mall doesn't sell anytime soon.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if it does, we'll approach the new owners and see if they'll let us keep it there. But if not, we'll find another space.
Yeah. Do you have an email address or a website for the memorial where people can send in their names?
We have a Google form that we shared on Facebook
Okay.
for Florida. If you go to Rosie's Facebook, it's Yellow Heart Memorial,
Mhm.
and you can just kind of go through the post to find the one for Florida. But a
Okay.
lot of states are doing these, and a lot of states are accepting names from anywhere. So
Okay.
not just Floridians or not just, people from Oregon. A lot of different states are doing that. At first, we just left ours open to Florida because our numbers were so high. But now we're starting to accept names from all over the country, well, the world for that matter.
Okay.
But yeah, Yellow Heart Memorial on Facebook.
Okay. And the other thing that I know that you have been doing is Bobby's Bikes in honor of your brother. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about Bobby's bikes.
Mhm.
So, um, I was in darkness for a very, very, very long time, and I didn't think I was gonna make it, to be honest with you. I thought I was gonna die of grief. And so the months kept passing and I wasn't getting any better. And around Christmas time in 2020, my oldest brother said, well, maybe we should give some bikes away to a couple kids. Do that in Bobby's memory. And we should start a kettle for Salvation Army online. I was like, yeah, those are great ideas. And so we did. We started his virtual kettle because Bobby will always have a kettle with the Salvation Army now.
Oh,
And then we bought 3 or 4 bikes and a wagon, and each of us pitched in a little bit of money, and my son Nick found a family that needed them, and he took them over there, and, we never saw the kids or anything. We just, made sure the bikes were there, and Nick took care of it. And then I knew we had to do more than that. So we officially started Bobby's Bikes, and we refused to let go of his spirit of generosity where he bought donuts for the homeless people or went and found a gift real fast for an unexpected guest or, bought me a cup of coffee because he heard me ask a lady if the coffee was fresh, like that goodness of him can't be let go.
mhm,
And so I've told myself that as long as I'm doing memorials, as long as I'm working on Bobby's bikes, I can wake up again tomorrow.
mhm.
So in 2021, we gave away over 60 bikes to children who didn't have one. And we held 2 events in Florida, and then we traveled up north and held 3 events up there. And the last event was our most successful because I partnered with my friend, who I mentioned earlier as an ICU nurse. She lost her daughter, Savannah, the month before Bobby. It wasn't COVID related. But so my friend went from grieving her daughter right into working and saving lives in a pandemic. And in that, she started Savannah Smiles. And her foundation is to help kids who come from families of addiction. I saw that she was having a Christmas party and I said, hey, do any of your kids need bikes?
Mhm.
And she said yes. So she made a list and it worked beautifully. She made a list. She gave me names. She gave me ages. I would order from Walmart or Walmart.com. So either my brother George was running to every Walmart in the area, wiping them out, or
Mhm.
I would send them to my mother in law's house. Then we traveled up there, and my husband, his cousin, George, several people came over and put all the bikes together. And George loaded up the trailer, took all the bikes down to Savannah Smiles, and it was beautiful.
Yeah.
It was so beautiful. And there was this one little girl in a purple shirt, and her face lit up. She just couldn't believe that she just got a bike. And I thought, oh my God, if only just that one little girl had received a bike, that would have made everything worth it. But Bobby would have loved seeing her joy because he just loved seeing people smile.
Yeah.
So then she walked over and gave me the biggest hug. So in this, I've learned that I can be happy, sad because it's the best I can do. I can be happy these kids have bikes and I'm bringing them some joy through doing this. But that sadness is always there. I'm never going to let go of the sadness.
Yeah. So you're coming up on a couple of years since Bobby passed
Mhm.
away. What are, uh, with Bobby's bikes and the Yellow Heart Memorial, what are the things that have helped you the most work through or process or just be with your grief?
Well, I attribute a couple of people or groups to helping me. The first is COVID Survivors for Change.
Mhm,
Every Thursday, there's a group for grief and trauma. I've been going since October of 2020 when they first started because the months between April and October, I could not find anybody who understood the hell that I was in.
mhm,
And people were dismissive. And I was in a grief group where the lady was saying the next month we were going to have an extra session on holiday triggers. And I tried to explain to her that I'm triggered all the time. I'm still in the pandemic that took my brother. We're wearing masks, which is a sign of the pandemic. I hear somebody cough, I hear it immediately. I hear somebody sneeze, I hear it immediately. I'm constantly looking, I'm holding my breath because I don't want to breathe in what they just spewed out.
mhm,
And she proceeded to tell me that God wanted Bobby and it was his time to go home
mhm,
and totally dismissed these triggers. And I thought, oh, well, wait a minute. My triggers aren't valid, but yours about holidays are. And I never went back to that group. So it was very fortunate that I found COVID Survivors for Change. And then the first night, I finally connected to people who understood the pain, they understood the horror.
mhm,
And it was so good to feel like I could tell somebody and not be questioned or, dismissed. And then, of course, I had my husband who took care of me 100%. Like, I just either, if I wasn't crying, I was sleeping. I didn't care if I ate. He would say, well, what do you want to eat? And I was like, I don't care. He'd say, well, do you want chicken? I don't care. I
mhm,
did not care. Just if you're going to fix something, I'll eat it. If not, I don't care either. Like it was bad. So he took care of me so well. And then, my brothers would call and check on me because my brother Tim knows me very well and he knew I wasn't doing good. And, I'd get a call every so often just checking on me. And a couple friends that one invited me to go to the track with her twice a week. And I'd cry all the way to the track, cry the whole time I was there and all the way home. But I kept doing it. And all of those things helped.
yeah. Do you and your family, do you feel like you're like together in your grief, or do you feel like there's certain members of your family who want to move on or away from it, or that you can't talk to about it?
So my family is basically five brothers and a mom.
Mhm,
And then I have a bunch of nieces and nephews and my sons. But among my brothers and my mother, at first I thought my mom was going to die of grief. She always said she couldn't lose one of her kids. And I thought, this is it. She's
mhm,
probably going to die soon. And then I realized it was me that was probably going to die of grief. But um, she kind of put on a mask. So, not the kind of mask we're used to, but
mhm,
I would call and she wouldn't say much. And I thought, well, that's odd. So maybe she just didn't want to put her pain on me. But I think my brothers have all dealt with it different. I asked George once when I saw him when I was up north, I said, doesn't it hurt? And he said, well, I think about it. He said, but he looked me straight in the eye and he said, but he's in a better place than we are. And given our environment, I don't know that I can argue with that anymore. It's like I have this great idea that Bobby's living in heaven, and for the longest time, you know, well, God's got him, he's in a better place. And I'm like, yeah, but I want him here.
Yeah.
But at the same time, here isn't a pretty place right now. And it hasn't been for a while, but I still don't want him gone. But
Yeah.
that's how George expressed it to me. Like, I think George really feels like Bobby's in a better place. Then I have a brother named Junior who doesn't talk about it much at all. Um, Brian doesn't talk much about it to me, but he might with his daughter or other people. And my brother Tim was in Beirut back in 1983, and he saw 241 Marines get blown up in the Marine barracks bombing.
Oh,
So he's already been through another kind of hell.
yeah.
So he told me one day, he said, you have to find a way to make it okay to get through it. He said that's what he had to do. And I guess with Bobby's bikes and the memorials, and anytime I can be involved in something, that's how I make it okay.
Yeah. So, one last question I ask everybody is, what do you say to people who tell you that COVID isn't real?
Oh, well, people really showed me who they are over the last 2 years, and I'll never unsee what I've seen. And just a while back, it wasn't very long ago, I told Nick, I said, I'm just stunned at the way people still act like the virus doesn't exist. And he said, really, Mom? Are you really stunned?
Mm,
No, I'm not. Disappointed, absolutely disappointed. But we had a responsibility to take care of one another. And as a society, we totally failed.
yes.
And I have friends and, people on social media that I know who claim to be Christians, quote, Christians, who have said things to me such as, are you sure Bobby had COVID?
Mm,
Did he have underlying conditions? How old was he? Are you sure he didn't die of pneumonia?
mm,
Are you sure Bobby was in pain? It is so rare that I hear somebody say, I'm sorry for your loss.
yeah.
So rare. And, all of these people, they suddenly became epidemiologists. Many of them graduated high school, but yet now they know everything about science. And they were promoting drugs they knew nothing about. They ridiculed masks. They used racist terms to describe the virus. They minimized it. They downplayed it. And meanwhile, family after family were losing loved ones.
Yeah.
And we weren't finding compassion. And they don't get a pass. I hear Christian people say, oh, but we're not perfect. True. No Christian is perfect.
Hmm.
However, they didn't even try. Jesus said, like, I'm not a big Bible pumper or anything, but like, I know some basic things. And Jesus said the second greatest commandment is to love your neighbor.
Yep.
They didn't love their neighbor. That's all that was asked of them. Wear your mask, wash your hands, stay 6 feet apart. But no, that was just too much for some people. But on the same token, I've seen the best of people.
Hmm.
And I was a young mom. I made lots of mistakes, but both of my boys turned into really good men. And when the pandemic broke out, my youngest Nick, I, he was just helping everyone. And I kept seeing this meme going around from Mr. Rogers that said, my mother would tell me, or would always say to me, look for helpers. You will always find people who are helping.
Yep.
That described Nick. who I should add is not a professed believer in God. He could be atheist, agnostic, but definitely not going around with his quote Christian label.
Mhm.
But while those people were mocking and downplaying, Nick was out there making sure that his friends and our family had food and supplies. He risked his own health to go to the grocery markets when the shelves were emptying.
Yeah.
He took care of everyone, including his grandmother, who was crippled just a few months before. She had no way to go shop for herself. And Nick was going by, dropping food off at the porch. So my other brother lives with her, but he can't drive. But, so Junior can come out, grab the groceries, and go back in. Nick took care of people. And every time I see the Mr. Rogers quote, that's all I think of is
Yeah.
how Nick did that. And then he took the goodies and the cell phone over to Bobby. He hung out the window or hung out beside the window just to bring him some comfort. And he told Bobby about this time when he was a little kid that, Bobby would take him riding on his bike on the handlebars. So Nick's actually one of the original Bobby's Bikes kids. But,
Oh,
like I'm sure that made Bobby feel good to know that Nick appreciated that all these years later because he's almost 30 now. And when Bobby passed, Nick was the one trying to fix me. He
yeah.
failed, but, you know, there's no fixing me, but he tried. And so one day I'm going to look back at the pandemic and I'm always going to remember people who were so cruel, who showed me who they were. And I'll always remember the helpers, the people like Nick, the people like COVID Survivors for Change, the people like Rosie Davis of Yellow Heart Memorial.
Yeah.
I'm going to remember all of it. And my friend circle got smaller.
Yes, mine did too.
And that was shocking to me. I didn't see that coming.
Yeah, I didn't either. I didn't either. My mom had Alzheimer's, so it was always assumed that that's what she would pass away from. And I was surprised too. There was some dismissiveness. Well, she's in a better place now. I don't care if she's in a better place now. I want her here. I couldn't see her or touch her. Well, I could see her through a window, but I couldn't touch her for 5 months before she died. I wanted her to make it. I wanted her to be there so when the doors opened, I could go in. Oh, yeah, it's heartbreaking. It's just heartbreaking.
The only time I've accepted that Bobby's in a better place is when George said it. And
Mm,
I guess because George sees the world for what it is. And, it hasn't been that great lately, but I still know that Bobby was better off with us. you know, we could, I could go by there today if he was still around. And, well, I'd have to get to Indiana first, but
yeah.
go play games with him at the nursing home or, take him out for a movie or bingo, whatever, do arts and crafts with him. He had another good 20, 30 years. There's no reason for him to be gone other than the failures that happened with this virus.
Yeah. And I can imagine that having Bobby in your life kept you very in the moment when you talk to him, when you are around him, and as a member of your family. He was there, like he was right there, always appreciating just that moment. I can imagine that that's such a beautiful thing that you miss about him.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I miss our phone calls and,
Mhm.
you know, so many things that, he would tell me stories and sometimes he would forget and then he would tell me the story again. And I'm kind of like, I've already heard this one. Or, he would tell me things like, he's in the nursing home and he'd say, well, these people aren't doing their job. And for the longest time, I thought, come on, Bobby, be grateful. These people are helping you out. But now, Bobby was right. They weren't doing their job, not in the end.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's very missed, very missed. He and my mom were two peas in a pod, and she used to pick him up and take him to this little dinner theater like once a month or once every couple months. And take him out shopping. He loved the thrift stores, just he just loved to go and do and live, and all that got stolen from him.
Yeah, it did. Well, thank you. Thank you today for telling his story and sharing the story of your family and everything that you went through and are going through.
Yeah, this doesn't end for us. People talk about, well, we need to go back to normal. Define normal. Normal for me is I'm the baby of a family of 6 with 5 brothers. I don't have 5 brothers anymore. There's no normal for me to go back to.
Yeah. And I feel like the COVID community understands that. I feel like that's where we find our uh, collective grief shared and people who nod their head and get how that feels, the new normal. Because so many people have not experienced a COVID loss and they want to just move on. They want COVID to go away. But for us, it's always going to be there. We're always going to have this grief and this prolonged grief that we've been going through and a loss that with so many questions and anger and coping and the remoteness of it all.
I agree. People who haven't been through it will never understand.
They will not.
And, they have no idea what it's like to lose somebody that you didn't get to see, or you didn't have to have, in many cases, people didn't have funerals, you know. And I've redefined what luck means to me. We were so lucky we got to have the 2-hour viewing and the 30-minute service and the parade. That's lucky, because some people, they dropped their loved one off at a hospital, never saw them again. No funeral. They were just gone.
Yeah. And you didn't know, at least I didn't know, how important those grief rituals are until I couldn't have them. I couldn't go hug my mom's sisters. There was just so many things. And I just sat inside my house with my husband, and that was it.
Hmm. Yeah. And the world was very different. I came back home and laid on the couch crying to my husband, or in bed trying to sleep away my feelings. And I mean, I didn't want to go out in public. I didn't want to be around other people because Bobby told me don't get the virus.
Yeah,
I'm not going to get the virus. So it's been lonely. But so many things are different than what other people have experienced. They'll never know unless they experience it too.
yes, and we don't want them to.
No.
Yeah,
No.
that's the thing. It's like you don't understand, but I also don't want you to go through this so that you understand. Yeah,
Very true. And when people say the cruel and ugly things, you wonder, like, if you only knew the pain, you wouldn't say those things.
I agree. Well, thank you. Thank you, Deborah, for sharing his story today.
But thank you, Jennifer. I so appreciate getting to talk about Bobby, because that's my favorite thing to do these days.
Yeah.
I love getting to share about him, and, you know, I can laugh and cry.
Yep. And that's how we do it. We laugh and we cry and we talk about them and every little bit helps.
Hmm. Yeah, we'll never forget.
And that's the show, everyone. If you've lost a loved one to COVID and would like to share your story on the show, please send me an email. My email address is forthosewelostpodcast@gmail.com. This show won't ever have a members area or episodes that you have to pay to listen to, but there are expenses to hosting a podcast, and if you'd like to help, you can support this show at buymeacoffee.com/forthosewelost. The link is in the notes below. If you like this episode, please share the show. Share it with your friends, share it on your social media, and once you've done that, Rate and review this podcast on your favorite listening platform, and then go rate it on Apple Podcast, because that's where most of our new listeners come from. Ratings and reviews are the main way this show finds new listeners. So please share the show. Until next time.